Chapter 1. Why Must You Die? Tirzah skirted a small gray lizard and pushed the strap of her goatskin bag further back on her shoulder. At her side, Oren worked the wooden crutch under his left arm across a tangle of creeping vines. They were among the thick reeds at the edge of the Nile marsh. Everywhere knives flashed as stacks of dry grasses bound in bundles grew beside their young cutters. Only the children had been spared for the task today. From behind them, someone jeered, "Hey, Goatfoot, when are you going to start working?" Tirzah's hand darted to Oren's bony shoulder, gripping it hard, steering him forward. "It isn't your name," she whispered. "Your name is Oren, and that is all you answer to," she commanded her small brother fiercely. Oren's face burned a deep red, but he said nothing. Just ahead was a thicket of grasses where they could work out of sight of the rest, and she headed there. The sun sent down a steady heat in spite of the breeze. Birds hidden in the grasses clicked and chirped, calling noisily. Others clung to the tops of swaying reeds. Oren, his crutch lying nearby, worked on his knees, his crippled foot dragging behind. Tirzah, bending over, worked her way toward him. The sound of running feet made them both look toward the path that led to the road to Succoth. "Egyptians," she said, keeping her voice low. Oren watched the runners pass, two of them dressed in the loincloths and headgear of the military. "Medjay from the look of them," he said, probably after some runaway slave. Tirzah shook her head as the Egyptian police disappeared from sight. "Whoever it is, I hope they don't find him. Hebrew slave, Nubian, or some poor captive from the Egyptian raids on other countries, it was all the same. They would beat the runaway and return him half dead to work in the mines or worse." She picked up her knife and bent once more to the grasses. Oren reached for a clump of reeds and froze. From the thicket that grew high above his head, two dark eyes stared at him. He swung around to grab his crutch and gasped as the form of a man stood up, parting the reeds in front of him. Tirzah whirled to face them, a handful of grass still in her hand. Startled, she stepped back. The stranger was thin and bony, not an Egyptian from the look of his beardless face. Mud spattered his torn tunic, and bits of grass clung to his hair as he stepped warily into the clearing. "What do you want?" Tirzah asked, her heart beating fast. The man turned his empty palms up in a sign of peace. "Nothing. Nothing more than to get out of here in one piece," he said. From the ground where he still knelt, Oren held his wooden crutch like a shepherd's staff, ready to swing. "You're the one the Medjay were after, aren't you?" Tirzah turned snapping eyes on her brother, warning him silently to hush. The stranger looked at Oren for a moment. "Peace, young man," he said. "You are right. Those two would like to have my head. I have done nothing more than any slave would do, given the chance to escape. I ran." A look of cunning crept into his eyes, giving his face an unpleasant hardness. "I am Manetto, an Amorite, slave no more in the Pharaoh's mines." "The mines?" Tirzah barely whispered the words. It was a rare thing for a slave to escape from the mines except by death. Manetto's voice was proud. "Yes, the mines, little one. Even there we have heard of your Moses and the God of the Hebrews. When your people go, some of us will leave also. But first I must get out of here," he said, tightening his ragged belt. Tirzah looked at the swampy marshes from which the stranger had come. "Where will you go?" she asked. "By now, those sons of donkeys are heading for the road of Megiddo, where they think I will run to escape into the Sinai. But I have no intentions of running further." He looked deeply at Tirzah. "The land of Goshen suits us for now, eh?" With a slight incline of his head, he was off, walking with long strides on the path to the village fields. As he turned, Tirzah saw his back, where the rags of his clothes hung in torn strips, marks of the lash crisscrossed in angry scab scars, not yet healed. Her stomach lurched, and she turned away. Using his crutch to steady himself, Oren stood up. It was always an effort for him to stand. Tirzah bit her lip as she watched him. It was certain that if they did not leave Egypt, Oren would be sent to the fields in the next quota of slaves. The Egyptian taskmasters with their snake-like whips would show him no mercy. Her fingers tightened on the grasses in her hand until they hurt. The Pharaoh must listen to Moses. Yahweh, the Lord God, would make Pharaoh let them go. "Hey, did you see the fellow's back?" Oren said, breaking into her thoughts. She murmured, stooping to gather a last armful of grass and throw it onto the rest. She didn't want to think of the taskmasters and their whips. Her father and the other slaves would need all the dried grasses they could find to make the bricks Pharaoh demanded. Tirzah straightened her cramped back. The marsh grasses were poor, but they would have to do since Pharaoh refused to give them Egyptian straw. Fiercely, she pressed the top of the load down. Pharaoh was punishing them because he was angry, but he couldn't stop them this time. Oren helped her with the bundles as Tirzah lashed it. They headed back, dragging it between them. By afternoon, she had forgotten the slave from the mines. The house, with its thick mud walls and dirt floor, was cool. A large, brown scarab beetle, sacred to the Egyptians, scuttled away as Tirzah picked up the water skin. Quickly she put down the water, stooped, grabbed the bug by its shell, and threw it into the courtyard. Beetles or not, she would miss this little house where she had been born and lived all of her 12 years. But not for 100 houses would she stay in Egypt. To live free even in the desert would be better. A stab of doubt cut into her thoughts. Would Pharaoh refuse to let them go this time? Oren's low drone above his lessons broke into her thoughts. His crutch was leaning against the wall. Beside it, he was sitting cross-legged, his dark head bent over the papyrus on his lap. As he concentrated, a small frown creased his forehead. A dry cough that kept him thin made him pause and look up. Tirzah was used to his coughing, but today the sound nagged her. How would he last in the desert? When he was a baby, she had carried him on her back. He would make it through. She would see that he did. Crossing the room, she stood above him to look at the papyrus with its strange ink drawings. You study too much, she said. What is it you are learning this time? Pastor says I can write well enough now, and so he will teach me the stories of Thoth, the bird god. Quickly, Oren lowered his eyes, as if fearful of what she would see in them. Like a darting lizard, Tirzah moved to grip his chin, forcing him to look at her. How could you listen to teachings about Egyptian gods? Do you want to make Yahweh angry? Though she didn't do it, she was cross enough to shake the stubborn look from his small boy's face. Have you forgotten that it was once the law of Moses to throw Hebrew boy babies to the crocodile god of the Nile? They would feed you to him if Pharaoh didn't need slaves for his fields and mines. Oren's lower lip trembled, and Tirzah released his chin. You shouldn't even listen to stories that might anger Yahweh. The gods of Egypt are his enemies. Tirzah looked straight at him, a warning flashing in her eyes. The Hebrew people have no God but Yahweh. Oren looked away. I know, but Pastor is a good man, he insisted in a small voice. He taught me to write. I would insult him by not listening to him these last few days. Tirzah stamped her foot. How can you forget that he is an Egyptian? Do you want to be a slave for the rest of your life? Oren would not look at her. Promise me, she said. You won't listen to any more of old Pastor's stories, or I will tell our father, and he will forbid you to see him. Carefully, Oren rolled the papyrus, reached for his crutch, and struggled to his feet. His brown eyes burned hotly, and he swallowed hard. You can stop worrying. I'll give the scroll back to Pastor, he mumbled. Tirzah patted his arm, but Oren pulled away. She knew that the old Egyptian scribe treated the lame child like a grandson. Softening a little, she said, You have to do it, Oren. Here, take the old man a honey cake. Without a word, he took the cake she held out to him. She watched him move to the door, her eyes lingering on the deformed foot. From the courtyard, her mother called impatiently, Tirzah, where is that water? Quickly, Tirzah poured water from the large clay jug into a small bowl and hurried out. As she stepped from the doorway, for a moment the afternoon sun blinded her eyes. It didn't matter, though. She could have walked the familiar yard blindfolded to where her mother knelt, grinding meal. Eagerly, her mother reached for the bowl. Thank you. I feel as if I could never drink enough water these days. Silently, Tirzah watched her drink. Even with dark circles under her eyes, her mother was still young and pretty in spite of a bulging stomach. I can do that, Mother, if you want to rest a while. Tirzah knelt and picked some of the husks from the partly grown grain. Slowly, her mother rose, the folds of her robe falling softly about her permanent stomach. Promise me that the moment your father and Ram come, you will call me, she said. They will want their meal. Tirzah knew. The Egyptian taskmasters kept their slaves working the whole day with only water to keep them going. I promise, she called. Her mother was already walking toward the house. How will it be, after all these years, to have a new baby in the family? Tirzah mused. Would this one be born lame as Oren had been? A small green lizard slid away from the shadow of the grinding rock as she worked the stone pestle to crush the grain. Sweat ran down her face, and she stopped to wipe it away. Maybe this time it would be a girl who could help with some of the work. She finished the last of the grain just in time. They're coming, Mother, she called. But why was her father leaning on her brother Ram and their uncle Caleb? Between them, her father limped as if in pain. Behind her, Tirzah heard her mother's sharp intake of breath. Already neighbors were gathering around the men as Tirzah and her mother ran to them. What has happened? My husband! What have they done to you? Tirzah's father stood as straight as he could. It is all right, woman, only a beating. As she helped her father toward the house, Tirzah saw his back. The whip had made long stripes, dark, angry welts, caked with blood and dirt. Other lines crossed the first ones, and bits of flesh hung loose. Tears ran down her cheeks, filling her mouth with salt as she followed the procession. Gently, they lowered him face down on a mat. Turning his eyes from his father, Ram spat. That Pharaoh, he doesn't listen to reason. How can we make bricks without straw? While we look for it, they taunt us. Today they would not let us use dry grasses without straw. We could not find enough to make our quota of bricks, and you see what they did. Ram raised his fists. It's all because of that Moses. Ever since he came here, we've had trouble. His uncle stood and grasped Ram's arm in one huge hand. You must not raise your hand to Yahweh's chosen, Ram. Ram lowered his hand and his eyes. I keep forgetting, Uncle. I was young once too, Ram, Caleb said quietly, holding up his well-muscled arms, and these arms felt the lash more than once. Ram turned his face to the wall. But why must we suffer more? Do you think Pharaoh will let us go? 8 times he has pretended to say go. Enough, Ram. That's enough. Even from his place on the mat, her father's sharp command made Tirzah jump and Ram stiffen. A gray shadow of pain crossed his face as her mother, applied a wet compress to his back. You have seen the miracle, son. The Nile turned to blood. The gnats, the boils, all set upon Egypt. Have any of us had these things here in Goshen? He winced as the cloth touched a wound. Ay, woman. Ram, you know what I say is true. The Egyptians are feeling the lash of Yahweh's judgment. Ram said nothing, but Tirzah could feel his anger. Look at me, Ram, when I speak, her father commanded. Red-faced, Ram obeyed. Soon we will leave this place, and not even the Pharaoh of Egypt will be able to hold us back. Well spoken. The words rang from a lean, gray-bearded man with the deepest set, clear blue eyes Tirzah had ever seen. He entered with a firm stride. Aaron, welcome, her father said. Tirzah, a drink for our guest. No, I cannot stay. I have come myself to see how you are, Jeraheel, Aaron said, and to take a look at your back. He bent above the wounds, probing gently with his large hands. So, it is as usual. They do a thorough job, he said. From a small jar, he poured oil on the broken skin as he talked. You have said rightly, Jeraheel. There will be no more slavery for you or any of us. Tomorrow, Yahweh will send thick darkness on the land of Egypt. The Kamsin, her father murmured. It is that time of year. Without crops to hold down the soil, the wind will tear it away. I dread to think of it. Already the 50-day wind from the desert blew from the south and southwest. For 2 or 3 days each year, it became a great force, picking up sand and dust. This will be like no other Kamsin, Aaron said. The Egyptians will not be able to leave their homes. Here in Goshen, we are protected and will have light while they sit in darkness. Wiping the oil from his hands, Aaron looked at Ram. Tirzah saw the question in Ram's eyes, just as Aaron must have. Aaron didn't speak directly to Ram, but included them all. After that, Yahweh will send such a thing to Egypt that even Pharaoh will beg us to go, he said. The last plague will bring death to the firstborn in every Egyptian household from the Pharaoh down. Her mother gasped, and Aaron looked at her gently. Yes, Leah, it must be so. Judgment will fall on Egyptian sons if Pharaoh refuses to let Yahweh's children go. Pharaoh has set himself against Yahweh. Aaron shook his head sadly. You have the lamb ready for sacrifice when the time comes? Yes. Everything is as Moses said, her father replied. Tirzah thought of the lamb waiting in the courtyard pen. Then the time is here, her father said solemnly. Placing the jar of oil in a small pouch, Aaron nodded. It has come at last. Now I must go. May the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob reward your faithfulness. As quickly as he had come, he was gone. Tirzah stood staring at the empty doorway, the cup of water she had fetched still in her hand. When she turned away, Uncle Caleb was smiling at her. His merry eyes shone as he took the cup in his huge hands. Yes, little bird, that was Aaron, a man of great strength. May I be as strong as he and Moses when I am that old. Tirzah laughed. It was well known that Caleb, her father's younger brother, was already as strong as a bull. In one gulp he drained the cup, set it down, and took his leave. As Tirzah fetched food for their meal, she heard Ram mutter, 2 old men against the Pharaoh. It's madness. Tirzah wanted to shake him for his stubbornness. Instead, brushing past him, she gave him her darkest look. At the house of Passer the Egyptian, Oren coughed politely and waited. The old man looked up from the roll of papyrus on his lap. So, young man, it is you. And what brings you here to Passer? Passer's faded eyes were gentle, his thin voice kind. Oren sat down awkwardly in front of his friend. I brought you a honey cake, Passer. He held out the small round cake. And here is the papyrus you lent me. Our family is going away soon. He stopped wondering what to say next. Passer lifted one gnarled, claw-like hand and lightly touched Oren's shoulder. So, the rumors are true. This Moses, priest of the Hebrew God, will take your people into the desert to hold a feast to your God.
But I think you will not come back, eh? Oren did not answer or move. Passer withdrew his hand and picked up the honey cake. Thank your mother for me. She makes a good honey cake. Passer ate slowly, and Oren waited. At last the old man spoke. In Goshen we live quietly, Hebrews and a few of us Egyptians, eh? But all over the rest of Egypt, I hear talk of strange things happening because of this Moses. Flies and locusts, hail and sickness, but not in Goshen. The old man paused, a faraway look in his eyes. Oren sat quietly. He knew that these things were true. Perhaps your God watches over his people here in Goshen. Maybe he does not mind old Passer living in the house of my fathers. Like me, it is old, too, eh? His smile was almost toothless. It is a good house, Oren said, looking at the small house with the tall palms beside it. We must hurry then, boy, if you are to hear the stories of Thoth before you go. Silently, Oren shook his head. So, the old man said, you will not come again to Passer for lessons? Perhaps your God does not want to share you with Thoth, eh? No matter. I am an old man. I will sit and dream, and you will grow from a boy to a man. Maybe someday you will think of old Passer who taught you to write, eh? Stumbling in his haste, Oren rose and threw his arms around Passer's neck. I will never forget you, Passer. Never. Gently, Passer freed the boy's arms and gazed into the young face. When you leave, you shall have a present from Passer to take with you. Now go, child, to those who love you and wait for you. The old man watched the boy go. For a long while he sat staring into the distance. The soft voice of his niece, Mary, calling him for the evening meal, roused him from his dreaming. As Oren entered the house, Tirzah glared at him. There were no good Egyptians, old or not. She would have nothing to do with Egyptians from now on. Out in the courtyard, the yearly lamb began to bleat for his supper, and Tirzah went to feed him. Her father's orders were to see that nothing happened to the lamb before its time came. The little fellow sprang quickly to her hand, nuzzling it, looking for his food. He was a beauty, perfectly formed. Poor little thing, Tirzah thought, patting his head. She scratched under his chin. You are so beautiful, and yet you must die. It was necessary. Moses had given them Yahweh's command to be ready. In every Hebrew home, a lamb must be sacrificed on the night that the last judgment fell upon the Egyptians. Its blood would be spread on the doorway, a sign, her father said, that they were trusting Yahweh. She patted the soft, woolly head, wishing that somehow she could let it escape before it was too late. I don't understand, she whispered. Why must you die? Finished with its feeding, the lamb lifted its clear, dark eyes and pressed against her hand.